Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. I could ask permission to speak. Ajahn Yaniko kindly invited me to. This is my first English Dharma talk. It's way easier to give them in Thai because my Thai accent is really, really heavy. So most of the Thai people that I've given Dharma talks to, it's been like 5 minutes or 10 minutes since I don't actually know that much. And I think, I'm not actually sure they understood more than maybe 60 or 70% of it because my vocabulary is just pretty bad. And but they were pretty forgiving. Mostly you can sort of talk about why you came to Thailand and, you know, what it's been like for you there, and it goes over kind of well. So, you know, thank you for the patience with the first English talk I've given. And wanted to begin by taking the opportunity to express you know, firstly, my gratitude just for being welcomed to the Abhayagiri community. I came about, it's been about a month and a half now. And it's just been really, really nice. And I feel very welcomed, and I've been grateful for that. It's been a long time since I've sort of been in a monastery of sort of a culture I'm familiar with, and people I speak the same language with as, so it's helpful, and it's been a good month and a half. And also to take the opportunity to really thank the retreat crew who has been working and meditating with us as well these past 3 weeks or so of the winter retreat, just to support all the monastics in their practice. And I know, you know, besides the blessing, we don't always have a chance to express our gratitude as monastics for all that you all do, but it's no small thing, and it doesn't, you know, I think it really, not just the day-to-day little acts of helping out here and there, sweeping the trails, you know, the enormous act of providing the meal. You know, I think all these things are powerful supports for all of the monastics here during their, you know, this opportunity where they really do get a chance to go deeply into the practice, but also just the retreat crew's general attitude and just how it's very heartening as a monastic and inspiring to see that other people see value in what we do, because you can sometimes lose sight of the bigger context when you're in a monastery for a long time. And like Ajahn or Kruba Sudiko said like a few weeks ago, you know, a lot of the time it just feels like as a monk all you're doing is going up in the mountain and trying not to freak out. So it's nice to see that other people see value in that and emote in it, and it really does give a lot of inspiration. So a lot of thanks to the retreat crew for all you do. I think last week, Tenpei Salo spoke about living in community very wonderfully, and I wanted to take the opportunity maybe to speak on the counterpart to that, about those periods of practice in the monastery and in this life where we find ourselves more alone with our practice, with our sufferings, with the ups and downs. And this seems appropriate given, you know, our entering the winter retreat right now. I think that the thing that really pivoted my life towards monasticism, I mean, there's a lot. There was the first time I read Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse, which in some ways is a pretty unmonastic book, actually. But it was when I was 15, and a really strong intuition that whatever the Buddha was doing and teaching, even the amount contained within the pages of that book was something profoundly worthwhile. A life spent towards cultivating the heart and developing wisdom and compassion seemed like one of the most beautiful lives you could live. And as soon as I read those pages in that book and saw that there was a form of life that one could embark on that would be dedicated completely and totally towards the cultivation of the heart in those ways, I felt a strong intuition that I wanted someday to try it. But despite beginning at that point to practice and study a bit, the real pivot point where I knew that I wanted to become a monastic was when after my senior year of college, I was, I'd been practicing regularly and all that, but I'd come down the coast on a road trip during spring break to survey grad schools for psychotherapy, and sort of the classic, I was listening to Top 40 radio, Justin Bieber, Taylor Swift, reading all the latest Hunger Games on my stops, seeing the class, Taco Bell, the just ceaseless distraction, because I'd spent the last few years steadily, there was a lot of wholesome things in my life, but also a sense of scrambling a bit, trying to find something to fill up some space that was not filling up. And there wasn't a strong, aching sense of existential anxiety in that I did have the practice, but somehow I knew that even the good I was doing and what wholesomeness I did have in my life wasn't yet worthy of my death, of the whole picture, that my life was meant for more and that I needed help with that, although I didn't know about that last part about needing help with it yet. But basically after a week of this road trip down the 101, just trying to distract myself every way, I decided to stop by Abhayagiri for the first time for a few hours, and I just walked onto the grounds and was met by a very quiet monk, and we talked for a while, and then I was just left alone, standing with my thoughts in this suddenly quiet environment. And in that stark silence, I found a mirror for all the pain that I had been running away from for so long. It was so clear that I was exhausted from running, and that I needed help to face what suffering I did have in my life and what shadow had been chasing me for so long. And not that shadow was anything especially dark. I lived a very, blessed childhood, and really, that sort of classic suburban middle class, raising up, and I don't have anything to complain about in that. And yet, the First Noble Truth is always there, and I think it can really boil under the surface in its own slow ways, even in a pretty privileged middle-class existence, until it steadily sort of leaches out a lot of the beauty in life, and things crust over steadily, and what meat and vitality experience had becomes dried and crusted, and all of life is sort of experienced through plexiglass, and so stepping into Abhayagiri, I saw very clearly that this is what it would take to turn towards suffering, which is that beautiful, completely counterintuitive prescription of the first noble truth, that you need to turn towards your pain, and that only through doing that will you, become free from it. It reminds me of a teaching by Jung, Carl Jung, and that what you don't acknowledge becomes your destiny. And I think that it's very true that what suffering we don't look at in our lives really ends up being what directs our lives. So I noticed that when I stepped into Abhayagiri, that for me, the restraint, the structure, the boundaries here were absolutely essential, because I just didn't have the self-control to enforce those things for myself. And that's when I knew that I had to be a monastic, that I had to use this form if I was going to live a life that was not diluted, and truly worthwhile and worthy of what I wanted to do on this brief stay on earth. And I think that, then I went to Thailand, I ordained there, and really appreciated the simplicity and the integrity of the structure of the whole Ajahn Chah lineage. The way the Vinaya is held within this lineage is extremely rare. I think, the sort of austerity of it in a very wholesome sense. For example, the fact that our monastic order still doesn't use or touch money. I was trying to think of other orders, even within the Buddhist world, who still hold that precept, and it's hard to find. And then you look just at these other aspects of the monastic life as it's held within this lineage, and even just getting 3 months out of every year during this winter retreat to really step away from all responsibilities and interactions and just pour oneself into practice, I think is absolutely essential in terms of growing into deeper and more refined states of mind that can ultimately issue into liberation. And so these were immediately apparent to me, the renunciation aspect. And I remember Longpa Pasano saying on my previous visit here that when he first ordained, he really kind of sometimes thought that the Buddha was pretty diabolical to create this code of conduct, which literally, if it's the formal code of the Patimokkha, it's 227 rules, fair enough. But if you look at our minor ordinances, it runs into the thousands at least. And of all these things we refrain from. And I remember Longpa Pasano saying that he felt like the Buddha was a bit diabolical in sort of cutting off every route to distraction. But that it was also the Buddha's great compassion that made him do this, that made him lay down this rule, this monastic code, because it forces one to walk directly towards the goal and cuts off every alternate route. So I've appreciated this a lot, and it is related to this whole aspect of being alone on retreat. We restrain a great breadth of social interaction, of distraction, especially during this time where we keep silence and try to practice intensively for many hours every day. But I found that this restraint for Westerners was something that had to be held delicately and touched carefully, because the code was, I found that the code, the way Ajahn Chah's lineage has held and passed down this Vinaya and this way of training has been done so in the Thai culture, and Thailand is very aptly named the land of smiles, and has a levity and metta sort of imminent just in the atmosphere there, and faith. And so these qualities naturally balance out the strictness and austerity of our form as monastics. However, when the whole Vinaya and this training and the sense restraint is taken to a Western context, a Western culture, our particular Western neuroses of sort of, self-degradation, stress, and, self-flagellation, which, to be fair, I don't believe are any more, in this day and age, are no longer Western, our particular inheritance just as Westerners. I think most of the young generation in Bangkok would have exactly the same thing, but as inheritors of a consumerist culture, it's certainly something that many of us have in us. And that when this is combined with the strictness of the Vinaya, and not held carefully and wisely, that the sense restraint can also lead to people getting pretty stressed out, to put it simply, and to a steady drying up. And I think that, at least in my experience when I first ordained, so many of us are carried by such powerful reserves of faith and really a joy at having found a way of life that feels utterly sincere and true. And I think many, non-monastics can relate also to first coming to the Dharma and feeling this same resonance and like it's really the right thing, like you're stepping into a footprint that was made for you. In the context of monasticism, I think that I've seen that initial flush of faith really be able to carry people for about 3 or 4 years. And then I find that if people haven't yet found ways of cultivating and building happiness within themselves, of finding a certain brightness in the mind from within, then things can get pretty dry, and either the practice goes pear-shaped or sometimes there's disrobal. Not that these things are always, necessarily wrong. I don't think everyone is meant to be a monk, but just speaking in this context right now. So I think as Westerners, it's important to really look towards, especially in times of retreat, how we're brightening the mind. I think if we have jhana, great, or appana samadhi, you probably don't have to worry about it too much. But for those of us who are still stuck on the far side of such refined states of concentration, we may have found some calm, but to also really look towards these other methods of brightening the mind and the heart. I find an aspect of generativity. I think as a monk it's easy to fall into just consuming in terms of reading Dharma books, listening to Dharma, eating food, is also a consuming activity, but even in those intellectual areas. And that's why I think it's so important sometimes to have something where you're creating, where you're using the creative instinct. Either little things on retreat can include, just simple things as hand sewing and stuff, but also I think maybe more involved things sometimes, or things that sort of honor the creative quality in the heart, like writing a few verses of poetry for a few minutes every day, or drawing a picture, like if you're into art. I think these can really, can help, and that, you look towards the examples of other monastic orders and how central art and worship is. And I think it's very important to remember that the Buddha taught by way of apophatic method, the way of negation, by telling us all the things that we aren't. We are not the 5 khandhas. You are not your personality. You are not this body. You're not your memories. You're not your perceptions. You're not sense consciousness. And he trusted time and again that if one practiced and let go of these things that we mistakenly take as ourselves, that we would come for ourselves to what we are, or to that state of nibbana. And then we would, having tasted it for ourselves, not need descriptions of it. However, I think that this extremely effective and efficient way of teaching method and praxis towards realization, when given to us Westerners, who many of us have a sort of dry materialist worldview, even the word cessation just brings to mind sort of darkness and just a lack. And that's why I think it's so helpful that many of the Western audience have begun to articulate, what the deathless is, and in as loose terms as you can, and acknowledging that it always falls short. But how often Longpo Sumedho speaks of the deathless, or Ajahn Sucitto speaks of the chitta, and this, what we are moving towards, and to remember and keep those qualities in mind of brightness, and that all this renunciation is for the sake of that brightness. I've asked Longpo Anan, my teacher in Thailand, or my mother did actually ask him this question, if Buddhism was compatible with Christianity at all. And Longpo Anan answered that if we consider God to be this man sitting up in the sky giving orders, then no, not at the ultimate level. But if, the word God implies something about voidness of, this sort of immanent quality in things, then yes, that these two ways of thinking can resonate. And so I think, small acts of finding ways to worship that beauty in our lives are really precious as, especially as monastics. Of course, I'm speaking to Dharma practitioners in general who are working to give up more coarse sensual pleasures. But just, in terms of monasticism, where the renunciation can be brutal and actually pretty traumatic, that acknowledging that unless we find ways to invite that beauty into our lives, that subtler taste of, you could call it the divine, the chitta, whatever, in as far as we're able to, without having actually realized liberation, that can really feed the heart and make it stable and make the monastic life stable. And that from what I've seen, if people don't manage to find a way of cultivating that in their experience, then after 4 or 5 years, things do dry up, and they're very easily knocked off balance. It's a bit as if I think all the sense restraint in the Vinaya, the structure, builds this enormous cathedral. It's this beautiful and enormous structure to hold space. And within that space, a great, many refined things can manifest. The rose window has a chance to blossom on the floor. There's space for the choir music to echo. There's, the scent of incense doesn't get dispersed by the wind. The structure, the cathedral, the flying buttresses, the granite, the Vinaya is essential. But if we're constantly and only looking to that restraint, we're like the architect with, his nose pressed to the granite stones day after day, and we never turn around and look at what that structure's created space for, this beautiful and utterly subtle sweetness which can pervade the life. I think the Buddha speaks very clearly towards this in the first verse of the Dhammapada, where he says that the untrained mind, behind the untrained mind, suffering follows like the wheel of an ox cart, the ox, whereas happiness follows the well-trained mind like a shadow. And you can see that the suffering, the image of suffering is very coarse, it's very visible. Whereas the happiness which one finds, at least in my experience through the practice of Dhamma, has a more subtle quality to it. And so it's hard to see at first, and it takes a certain amount, I think, of invitation and of focusing on it, of calling to it. And this is where I think that small acts of creativity, of really naming it in our experience, can be very helpful, because we've given up this coarser happiness that is in reality, has a quality of suffering to it, and we've been forced to renounce it. But unless we're, turning our attention towards the beauty and the happiness which we have to depend on to replace it, then we can miss it, and then we have nothing to hold us. It reminds me of my dad was telling me about a historian who was researching some old words in the European lexicon, and there was a word that the English had for the small burrows that animals make in bushes. And this historian was saying that the moment he learned the word for it, he started seeing them everywhere. And I think it's very clear that when we have language for something, when we try to name it and name it regularly in our experience, that we do begin to see it more. And I think this is why it's so helpful that so many of the Kruba Ajahns in the Western tradition now have really emphasized this word, the deathless, have really emphasized the deathless element of the citta, have pointed out to that subtle quality of beauty and sweetness and happiness which can come into life and is already there if we just have the presence of mind to look towards it. So I think this is, and also how that manifests in terms of the path that we find ourselves becoming more and more sensitive to as we walk in Dharma. I think we all have the experience that as the mind quiets down, we gain an intuitive sense in every situation that there's a way of doing something, a way of acting, which is utterly blameless and pure, and which we're in some sense meant to do. And I know Longpo Panyavado has spoken about how a measure for one's Dharma practice can be the sense of self-worth one has. Not in a worldly sense, but in the sense that one really feels that they were brought here for a reason, have a role to play in the world, and have true value to the world. I know for myself, the most beautiful moments of my life have been those moments where it really felt like I was stepping into my destiny. And those moments have always been tied to Dhamma. And I think many of the people here, from their commitment and from the act of coming to a monastery, knows what it feels like to understand that you've stepped into what you were meant to do. And I think this is related to these reflections on the citta, on a subtle beauty, is also the subtle sense that we can gain over time of what we're supposed to do, and that we do have a place in the world that matters. So I think a lot of this is pretty, can seem a bit airy and perhaps non-practicable, but I find that the sort of macrocosm, looking at sort of this balance of how much we stress renunciation in our daily awareness versus how much we look towards what that renunciation is supposed to be opening space for. I think that it can really be applied on the microcosm of meditation, at least in my experience as well. Specifically, this sort of, I think breath meditation, for the articulations of breath meditation I heard first coming to Buddhism, seemed a bit like this sort of a sort of unceasing stress on the renunciation aspect of monastic life as a parallel. just sort of stay with the breath at the nose, put aside all these other thoughts and distractions, and just do that again and again. But I found that in my own meditation practice, trying to sort of flog the mind into stillness this way through act of will didn't work for very long, and it certainly wasn't fun or enjoyable, and not sustainable either. However, when I kind of gave permission to myself to explore and really allow the natural inquisitiveness and energy that I think a lot of us have as sort of college-educated or educated, people in this culture, giving permission to use that within the breath meditation was very, very helpful. And so, just as, learning to ways to sort of channel and embody our natural energy and creativity and need for joy within the monastic life, so finding within the context of sitting in formal practice a way to channel our energies and mind's natural desire to investigate, to explore with very active minds. I know Longpo Nan has said that Westerners tend to think twice as much as sort of the rural Thais who ordained with him. These are very broad strokes and dangerous because of that, but I think we're all aware that we think way too much. And so I find that the way of breath meditation, which I think a lot of the Western Ajahns have been sort of speaking to, Longpo Suchito, Ajahn Jeff, Thanissaro Bhikkhu, his teacher's teacher, Tanpor Lee. I know Longpo Pasano has spoken to these as well, of using that third step of the Anapanasati Sutta, breathing in, being mindful of the whole body, breathing out, being mindful of the whole body, and taking that, not as the commentaries have taken it for so long, as being mindful of the whole body of the breath at the tip of the nose, which I think can work once one gains a certain amount of concentration, but rather taking it as becoming aware and sensitive to the body as a whole, the breath body, the subtle body, whatever you want to call it. And specifically, either experimenting with visualizations in terms of drawing the awareness and the breath energy down into the body, because I think that as in our ways of acting in the world, most of us are basically, I've heard this phrase before, disembodied heads drawing, sort of dragging bodies around, but not really aware of the body. And I think for breath meditation to be really successful and enjoyable, that we have to to some extent, re-inhabit the body and gain some sensitivity to it. So either very concrete visualizations of drawing, breath energy, or visualizing light coursing from the top of the head down to the feet, and just bringing awareness down into the body. And then, experimenting in many of the ways that, for example, Thanissaro Bhikkhu or Goenka speak about in terms of exploring the body and what happens when you put your awareness in different places in it, and the different resonances that the breath energy gains can be very helpful in terms of really gaining some familiarity with what's going on in terms of the energy. And that when one begins to do this, that it becomes a really pleasant experience, and there's a lot of piti available. And that you start to become familiar with where blockages are, where knots are. You can massage them out. You become familiar with where certain flavors of pleasure are located. And that when the mind has sort of run around the body for a while in this way, that it does actually come to a place where it's willing to settle and engage in more traditional breath meditation. But that, trying to sort of tell yourself to, after coming home from a day of work, to sort of tell the mind to shut up and just be at the nose is sort of like a substitute teacher walking into a classroom of screaming 12-year-olds and like telling them to sit down and do a math worksheet, like probably a bit more effective to kind of let them, do a more active, wholesome activity first, like, go out to the pond and run around taking, collecting samples or something, and then bring them into the classroom and tell them to do a worksheet. But like to give your mind a chance to run around a bit within the body and gain familiarity with it, I find that I find it's been very effective for me and many of the people I've known, and I think there's a reason why it's spoken to by many of the Western Ajahns right now. And there's very concrete instructions contained in Thanissaro Bhikkhu's Keeping the Breath in Mind. So, to just, once again, the parallel there being that in both of these situations, both the, restraint of monastic life, of Dharma practice in general, of renunciation, and very clearly of a retreat period where we cut ourselves off from almost everything that's given us, provided a lot of happiness for us in regular life. Finding ways of naming, looking to, worshiping, calling out, inviting in the beauty and the joy that is to be had if we only have this sensitivity and willingness to look for it and find some concrete means of doing that. Whether it be art or small acts of creativity or something else, or just reflection. It strikes me that sort of happiness, it's a bit like the taste of fresh snow. Very subtle and sweet. But I think in our gluttony for the world, we never give ourselves a chance to taste it. And in this environment of Dharma practice, and specifically a monastery, we're given this sort of somewhat mixed blessing of being robbed of all the other, more coarse tastes that we've lived on for so long, and which actually lets us gain the sensitivity to taste that sweetness, but that we have to have patience with that process and also, be sort of cultivating it and looking towards it. And that without some awareness of that and consciousness of that, we can become pretty stressed out, and practice can go really lopsided. And similarly, just not just looking towards that subtle beauty and subtle happiness, but also really acknowledging how we need to, within this form, find ways to express our natural, generative, creative inclinations as human beings in ways that are wholesome and allowable. In terms of small acts of creation or, just acts of relaxing a little bit now and again, and to not get too tied up in knots by the discipline and the restraint, and to really be able to take a step back every now and again and see if that's happening. And, the parallel being that informal practice, also trying to kind of flog ourselves into silence can only work for so long. And that eventually we have to find ways of not only giving permission to those natural inclinations towards exploration, towards investigation, with the mind and the breath, for, in this instance, if it's helpful, the breath body, the subtle body, and exploring that, and finding the sort of pleasure and pity that's available there. And also just within meditation practice in general, really looking to and remembering those qualities that, which we're coming towards through all this giving up. That quality of an inner intuition, a voice, a sense of purity, a sense of utter worthiness of what we're doing, and also of a very beautiful and blameless sense of happiness, which is not only profoundly valuable to us, but to all those in the world around us. So I won't make this drag on for much longer. I did want to just say that I think when we enter a period of intensive retreat, when the suffering gets going, it really can get going, and you can find yourself deep in it for weeks with very little perspective. And, just when those first Noble Truth days come, they can really slap you in the face repeatedly. And the third Noble Truth seems a long way out. And I want to say how profoundly valuable it is. I think when I see, and it gives me a lot of inspiration and motivation when I see others willing to face those storms and keep their heads down in the sense of enduring through them. Because when we really look around us in those hard times, all the conditions at this monastery are profoundly wholesome. Every once in a while we might, have to wash our bowl next to, someone who's a bit stressed out or something. But apart from that, everything that's coming in, in the environment is profoundly good. So everything that is coming up, all the suffering, it's all vipaka. It's all past karma. And if we don't work through it here, then we just go back out into the world, and it just continues to drive our destiny, to drive our actions, to hurt others. So however strange and sometimes, sometimes the work seems like nothing except not reacting as the storm blows past. But to really put out there that is the most profound and meaningful work we could possibly do, not just for ourselves, but for all those in our lives. And to really, that it's worthwhile, and it's why we're doing what we're doing. And it's, for those of us who have gone forth, it's why we've ordained. So on all these notes, there's a poem I really love by Mary Oliver called The Journey, which I'm going to try to end with if I can remember it. One day you finally knew what you had to do and began. Though the voices around you kept shouting their bad advice, though the very house began to tremble and you felt the old tug at your ankles. Mend my life, each voice cried. But you didn't stop. You knew what you had to do. Even as the wind pried with its stiff fingers at the house's very foundation, even though their melancholy was terrible, you didn't stop. It was a dark night, a wild night, and late enough already, and the road was full of fallen branches and stones. But little by little, as you left their voices behind, the stars began to burn through the sheets of clouds, and there was a new voice, which you slowly recognized as your own, that kept you company as you strode deeper and deeper into the world, determined to do the only thing you could do, determined to save the only life you could save. Anyways, I think I messed that up a little bit, but more or less that's the gist. So thank you, First English talk, and I appreciate everyone having the patience with it. So anumodana. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.